Welcome to the Bigwater Podcast. Ross Robertson here. We've got my longtime friend and legendary, literally award-winning outdoor writer, Steve Pollick. He don't do these podcasts. He don't do these things for just anybody. He joins us here at the Bigwater Podcast, and we're talking about some old stories, some new stories, and things that he just hasn't even talked about before. Being in jail was one of them. Welcome to the Bigwater Podcast. I am Ross Robertson, and we are doing what we always do, but we're just talking about it now. Fishing is what we do, but we've got an interesting guest today. We've got a guy that I kind of consider like the Dos Equis of outdoor world, outdoor radio, media, whatever you want to call it. He's been there, done that in the last 40 plus years. A man by the name of Steve Pollick, who definitely has helped me on the early days and put me in countless articles. Many guys know him as the outdoor editor for many, many years with the Toledo Blade. I know him also as a friend, and I'm fortunate to feel that. Steve, thanks for taking your time to join us today.
Good morning, Ross. Glad to be here.
You have been doing this a really long time, haven't you?
Yes, almost since dirt was created, I think.
I did a little searching because, I tried to do a little bit of prep on these things, and you joined the Toledo Blade in 1971. Is that am I close?
No, that's it, and that was just 3 years into the first time I ever wrote an outdoors column.
That's a fellow Ohio State guy.
Correct.
I'll tell you what, it's amazing that when you think about how many people have come and gone, because I can kind of remember, my grandpa and my dad listening to or watching and listening, doing the whole deal with Luke Lure, who I believe you took over for him, right?
Right. I followed Lou. In fact, he started in like 1923 and had like a 59-year career at the Blade, if you can believe that. And then I piled 40 years on top of that, 31 of it as outdoors editor. That we covered a long span between the two of us, a century.
And I'll tell you, it's kind of crazy, too, because when you retired, another Blade guy who wasn't really in that role or came from within, which was unique because of what happened before, Matt Markey, a lot of people are like, man, he's got some serious shoes to fill because, you had been there for so long and so award-winning and been there just kind of iconic, if you will. And the reality is you probably had some of those same kind of pressures replacing Luke Lure. I'm sure there was a lot of people that were like, hey, who's this Steve guy?
There's no doubt about that. There's definitely some startup work to be done when you start digging into the weeds.
It's kind of like that in fishing. It's when you replace somebody, I can relate to this. You've got to be 3 times better than them because if you're just as good, everybody thinks you're a piece of shit. You've got such big shoes to fill in someone's mind that you go, oof. And everybody does everything different. I mean, that's just the reality.
Oh, exactly. You end up etching your own personality into what you do, and either the public, your audience is going to buy into it or it isn't, and so my big deal all the years was as one sports editor who was my immediate boss used to say, take me with you. Let me look over your shoulder at what you're doing, and that's kind of the way I approached things and made it a very relaxed and easy approach, and tried to be very descriptive in the way I wrote things, so that people would feel that they were right along with me doing the experience that they couldn't do because they were putting lug nuts on tires and wheels at the Jeep all day.
Right. And that's one thing that I admire about you, because I'm not going to knock anybody or throw any names out there, but in the last 20 plus years, I've had an awful lot of media I've worked with in many different ways, shapes, and forms, and sometimes in the boat. And me and you spent, I wouldn't say a ton of time in the boat together, but quite a bit through the years. And, you actually wanted to be there. I can tell when somebody's getting a story and when somebody actually enjoys being there, enjoys the company and everything. And there's just a lot of guys that I don't really think that they're into it. I think they could write about makeup or something just as well as outdoor stuff, to be honest.
Yeah, I lived it. The job in a way was life to me. In other words, and it still is in many ways, that I could never separate vocation from avocation. It was all this. It was all one cloth to me.
There's a quote. I did a little research, believe it or not, even though I know you, I consider pretty well. A quote when you're one of your final columns that says, "I was not born with outdoor skills any more than anyone else." So I can't even read my own notes. That's not in there, but so a special thank you to my mentors, one and all. And that really is true. I mean, you pick up stuff from so many people through the years. I mean, so much of my fishing is based on what guys from the Dakotas and Minnesota do. My spinner pulling at ultra slow speeds, and stuff that I learned from our buddy Old Ugly, and it just kind of everything morphs into what it becomes. And there's so many people that play a role in things, and I'm sure it was the same for you with the writing.
Oh yeah, just the pantheon of great people, like I think of Jim Foffrich, Old Ugly himself, and Tommy Frisch, the Turtle Man, and Bob Archer, and Tommy Mayer, who invented the Tom's Walleye lure, and all those guys. I learned about Lake Erie and walleye fishing from them, from virtually from the early days, the late '70s on. I knew all those guys back then, when Lake Erie was just starting to bloom again, so to speak, algae aside, uh, and become the world renowned fishery that it is today. So I had that. Marion Garber, the world champion fly caster. I learned how to cast from him, and have passed that skill on to a lot of other people over the years. But it all came from Marion, and so people like that all along the line. Even when I would write about birds and ornithology, I had people like Harold Mayfield, the late Harold Mayfield in Toledo. He is world renowned ornithologist, just a fabulous guy. So I had great guys, and Lou Campbell, who used to be the outdoors editor at the former Toledo Times. Lou Kluwer, my predecessor. I was able to uh, associate with some great people and great national writers too. George Laycock, Irwin Joe Bauer. I knew John Ruthven, the tremendous wildlife artist down Cincinnati, and Bob Hart, who ran outdoor shows all through the Midwest. Just all kinds of people that was able to associate with, that all help somehow, bits and pieces, and sometimes a lot of big chunks along the way.
And the reality is your column, there was a lot of people, that would grab that thing and they would look at that, and whether it's a fishing report or finding out what's going on or just getting in the outdoors, it's kind of lost on this generation. Like, I don't think they really get it because they don't have to. You pick up your phone, me and you are texting now. I mean, right?
Oh, sure.
All of these things that, you can go on the internet, you can listen to this podcast and you can get it's at your fingertips, where you used to have to wait for that thing to be delivered on Tuesday, was it Thursday and Sunday? Now
Right.
it's at your fingertips 24/7. Heck, you can bring that thing up, Monday through Friday at ToledoBlade.com or Outdoor News, or, all these different places that you've worked with, and you get access to these people. It's just, it's almost, it's just hard for people to understand that haven't been through those different phases, I think.
Well, sure. I mean, I started out with a typewriter. I did go start with something at advanced as a typewriter and a notebook and a ballpoint pen. I didn't need a stone tablet and a hammer and chisel.
You were only a couple years off of that, though, from what I gather.
Yeah, I know. There's no two ways about that. But at any rate, and I went through about 11 different computer systems while I was at the Blade, and started out with the old Texas Instruments, on a weighed about 17 pounds, and you had a big roll of electronic impressed paper. And it was just unbelievable sending stories. But we thought it was tremendous because you could be sending a story from anywhere, and it went into the Radio Shack. They called them Trash 100s, the TRS 100 battery powered computer, and then all the way on up through the modern laptops. But I went through 11 different transitions with that, and it all helped tremendously. And then toward the end of my career into digital photography, I used to shoot film, actual real live celluloid film, 35 millimeter film, and it was just unbelievable because I'd go on these long trips and get back, and I'd have a 40, 50 rolls of film to develop and go through. Nowadays, you shoot something on your iPhone or on a digital camera, you get all instant feedback. You pick out what you want, press a couple buttons, and bingo, it's there.
Certainly don't have the age and the experience that you do, but I can relate to that just with, for me, my early magazine days when I was working for like In Fisherman and some of those other publications. It was slide film. You had to have slide film, and it was really expensive to get that developed. Like you said, you didn't know if it was good or bad. You can't redo it once you get back from the trip. And nowadays, like you said, we're shooting stuff. I mean, I've been in like Field and Stream magazine with half-page ads, or not an ad, but a picture, of a big walleye or whatever, and it's literally off my cell phone.
Oh, exactly. I've shot magazine covers with my cell phone, and it just I can't get over it. The resolution alone on it is as good or better than the finest Nikon film cameras I used to use.
Well, the reality is just it's a point and shoot where you don't. I mean, obviously those Nikons will do a better job if we're probably better with them, but the cameras, the cell phones just eliminate all the stupid work out. It just they get
That's right.
they get the ding dong out of it, if you know what I'm saying.
Absolutely.
But
Absolutely.
let's go back to. I mean, I don't want to like harp and be like I'm 100 years old either. But I mean, some of the old stuff is I think the things that people probably don't know as much because everybody talks about last week and they forget the earlier days, and going back to like some of the mentors and things like that. I think the one thing that is lost nowadays, and again, I don't want to like harp on this too much, but again, when you go on YouTube and you search all these things, you don't really know who has street cred. You know what I mean? And
Exactly.
you gave me, after I got vetted pretty heavily, and obviously we'll talk about Old Man Fofrich, aka Old Ugly, but that's how we met. I think I'm almost
Right.
certain. But the reality is you just didn't put anybody in your column. I mean, you vetted those guys, and probably when they didn't even know when they were being vetted. But nowadays, again, there's so many of these outlets and so much information out there, but you don't know who's the real deal. I mean, and it would be a lot tougher to probably be a writer nowadays because of that.
Exactly. It's very, very hard because everybody's got a bullhorn now with the internet. Anybody can do it, and unless you've got a way to vet what you're looking at, if you're not thinking about that, you can just get led down the primrose path.
Yeah, I don't know. It's a different world. Obviously, things are better, and it is what it is. But some of these things, I guess, if you're old school a little bit, it's tough to swallow. I don't know, just things with again how people do business. I mean, like the kids nowadays with the mentoring. I don't know if some of the newer generations really want to even be mentored. You know what I mean?
Yes, I do, and I wanted to touch on something you had mentioned about the old days and so on. One of the things that both the outdoors communications profession and even the major media today is losing is the professional ethics and standards of old-fashioned newspaper journalism, and it was uh, a very, very difficult thing for me to witness how much that has eroded. Again, anybody with a bullhorn is supposedly an expert now, and if it's packaged with a lot of flash and dash, uh, and people aren't thinking about being discerning in what they're reading or watching or listening to, uh, they're they're getting smoked.
Well, and listen, we're doing a podcast right now. I mean, I'd like to think that I got street cred after 20 years of making my living doing this and done pretty well with it. But the reality is there's a lot of people out there with podcasts, and anybody can do it. I mean, it doesn't really cost a lot to do it. It's not like, again, in the Blade, I mean, heck, even when you were there, I mean, how many outdoor writers were even in Ohio that were full-time outdoor writers?
There was a small handful, and we stuck together pretty well. The newspaper guys, the big time newspaper guys, there were only probably a half a dozen of us, and we all had a different standard by which our writing was judged, because we were trained journalists, and because our editors expected us to produce the same quality and discernment in outdoors writing as any investigative news story reporter would do. And those are standards that are and have gotten lost, and that's a shame, because we pay the price by dealing with a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and outright lies.
Are you saying fake news is even in an outdoors? Fake news?
Oh yeah, yeah.
That term has gotten pretty broad here in the last couple of years, hasn't it?
Oh yeah, it's pretty broad, but it's hard. Again, you have to be paying attention to what it is you're reading, who did it. Lots of times when I look up background information on the internet, I always look and see where it's really ultimately from, and I want to make sure it's like university research or government-based research or some.
And even then, you don't know, really.
Well, that's true. You got to make sure that the politics are strained out of it, but there's you just can't pick up anything off the internet and assume it's right, because you can basically assume it's wrong unless proven otherwise.
Well, I mean, and again, I don't want to be a shit stirrer, but I kind of am. So, I mean, you could even name that there are major, not talking outdoors right now, just magazines or print newspapers in general, where you can have one magazine, let's call it the ABC Gazette, and on the East Coast they have one title, and on the West Coast they have another title, or in the Middle America, you know what I mean, for the same article. Mm-hmm. And it basically, it's feeding off of what they think that customer base wants to hear.
Yeah.
And that's kind of like, I guess, I don't know, those are things that are just tough to swallow. I guess it's a little salesmanship. I understand that those things come into play, but again, just the credibility, it just, man, in our world, if you don't have credibility, you don't have much.
Exactly. In fact, I think it was Kluwer might have told me that the only thing you got to sell to your readers is your credibility.
Hard to get, easy to lose, right?
You lose that cred, and your column isn't worth the paper it's printed on, or now the web address it's broadcast on.
Well, and I got a ton of cred from you, being in your column because I mean, I was literally probably in my teens at that time when we first kind of started doing some stuff with Foffridge Junior and Senior, and again, I was winning some tournaments and some things like that, and Foffridge saw some things in me, and he took me for a little bit of a ride there to, on to bigger and better things, fortunately, and the reality is that's kind of getting back to that mentor thing a little bit. I just think it's so important, and it's so lost upon the latter generations compared to, like, these guys either don't want to help, or a lot of kids. I get these kids that come up to me and they're like, they just say, hey, we're gonna whoop your ass, and I'm like, oh, okay. Let me know how that works out for you. But
the reason I put you in my columns, it's because when I went fishing with you, we caught fish. And we caught good fish, and you knew why you caught good fish and where you caught good fish and when and so on. It just you produced results, and you knew what you were talking about.
I could
That
I can
just,
rem-
and that's really, really, it's just so critical.
I can remember one time fishing with you. We were up north of the border there, and we were fishing. And I remember you had told me, and this was earlier on in our stuff, I think, together before we got. I don't know if I won't dare say tight, but it's one of those deals. You can't fake it when it's just me and you in the boat. I don't know if you remember this trip or not, but it was during the mayfly hatch, and everybody was like, "Oh, we can't catch him, we can't catch him." And we went up there and we did some spinners, kind of slow, and I switched up to a half-ounce sinker from a
Yep.
3/4 ounce sinker. And that made all the difference because the way that the current was swinging around. And I told you that as we were doing it. And I remember you just laughing because you're like, man, this is a science, isn't it? And like, on that trip there, I mean, me and you were just like, I mean, you got to see that happen. And I know as a guy that, that wasn't like your end all be all thing, but you liked that process. And I think is that fair to say that, walleye fishing might not have been your favorite thing to do in the world, but you like seeing the process and the development as a
Oh,
writer.
that was that. I remember that day very, very well. It was up on the northeast side of Peely,
We don't need to
and
tell them too much now.
and we cleaned some clock that day. That was just unbelievable.
We caught some giants when everybody said that it's the mayfly hatch, you can't catch them, right?
It's exactly, and we had pictures to prove it, but people were still shaking their heads after they saw the pictures and read the column.
I can remember that I was back in my 20s then, and still get emails from people after that. Oh, those pictures weren't real. That's from long ago, and I guess that's when you're in your 20s, you take that with a little more. You don't take it like you do now. You know what I mean? You look at that now as a badge of honor. Back then, you take that as an assault. But
Yeah,
I guess it is what it is, right?
sure.
So, the one thing that I think about when I think of you is traveling around. And I mean, I don't know how many stories you've told me through the days, most of which I'd like to. We could probably do 10 of these things, I guess, is the point. But back in the when you went to the Arctic, I think it was in the late 90s.
Uh-huh.
I think that's the thing that separates you from a lot of the other outdoor writer guys, because again, you went out there and you did it. I don't even know if it's even possible nowadays to do that, whether it's cost or getting out of the office or the fact that there's damn near no outdoor real writers left. But I mean, you went out there and again, you were more like a travel blogger, I guess is what we would call it nowadays, right? If you're a young guy,
Well,
that's kind of what you were doing almost.
well, when I got appointed outdoors editor directly by Paul Block Jr., who was the late publisher of the Blade, and when he called me into his office, he said, I don't want to beat around the bush. He says, I want you to be my outdoors editor. He says, I want you to go all over the world just like Kluwer did. He says, the only thing I'm going to ask is just do the Blade some good. And those were my marching orders, and I never looked back. And he wanted personally to vicariously live in these rugged, faraway places and have these adventures and see things and do things through my eyes, because he couldn't. He was older, and he was also a newspaper publisher and a world-renowned biochemist, believe it or not.
I did not know that.
Yeah, he was actually a biochemist by. That's what he loved to do. He was a newspaper publisher by family birthright. So, but it was a strange combination. But the deal was, I had basically something of a blank check to go and do as I wanted, and just do the paper some good. So I started doing things I wanted to do. Yeah, my first trip into the Arctic was to go winter living on the land with the Inuit people up by Ungava Bay below Baffin Island in the Arctic in the middle of winter. And I went up and we hunted caribou to help send meat to some of the relatives from another village that had run out of meat for the winter, and these people are very meat and sea mammal, marine mammal dependent, seals and things like that. And I still remember, running with Sandy Ananak and his father-in-law Stanley Ananak. We went, oh my God, almost a day by snowmobile up into the Torngat Mountains between Labrador and Quebec on the east side of Ungava Bay, trying to scare up some caribou. And we got a couple, and when we took them back on a sled, they stuck the hindquarters on a bush plane for Nain, Labrador on the coast to send to their relatives. It was just unbelievable, I froze my hands solid on that trip too, and that's not fun when they thaw out.
Yeah, I actually, I don't know if you even know this. I got to spend, it was one of my dad's last hunting trips when he just knew, he's probably not going to be able to physically do it much more. We were in northern Alaska there, and the guy actually wanted me to run his fishing camp. And my dad was going on a bear hunt, and the long and the short of it is I ended up staying like 20-some days there, and we also spent a few days in an Inuit village. The one place we were at was Glosovia, Alaska, which is just above the Arctic Circle. And it's actually an old Russian mining town. And again, you're with guys that were two of these guys, Dewey Halverson, an Iditarod racer, and Jerry Austin was the main guy. It's funny because I can't remember breakfast, but I remember these guys' names. And Jerry just passed away here a little bit ago. But Jerry was like in DEA back in the day, like South American drug war stuff. And he literally moved to Alaska after that. And the people up there are just characters, is what I'm getting at. And, this guy was the first guy inducted in the Iditarod Hall of Fame, and he was an absolute mountain man. And it's a different world. It's not being cool, you know what I mean? It's not street cred up there. It's living, and it's just surviving.
Yep.
Just exactly. Like you said, when the plane comes and they're not taking pictures of horns. They're like, give me the meat so we can get through the wintertime.
That's exactly right.
So I mean,
that's exactly right.
And some of those people that you meet on these trips, I'm sure that, while you probably never get to see them again, you probably don't forget them because it's a different bond that you have. It's kind of like when we're doing this podcast. I said the podcasts to me are modern day camp stories because even though me and you talk every now and then, it's not enough, right? And we don't even sit down and talk about all these stories that much, even though we did here a couple of weeks ago, to keep these things kind of alive, if you will.
Oh, exactly. And they're a great outdoors adventure is timeless, whether it happened in 1985 or 2015.
That's right. I think sometimes time makes them better. They're like fish stories. Sometimes fish stories get bigger as they go, right? But that walleye was 30 pounds, but they truly do get better. I mean, probably one of mine too that I could hear 1,000 times, and I'm sure everybody listening at home will as well, is I don't even know what you'd call it, but when you did, it wasn't transatlantic, but you were on a sailboat for like forever. I mean, I don't even remember the specifics on that one. That's definitely why I want to hear this one for my own selfish reasons, if nothing else.
Well, my longtime friend Rex Damschroeder, who's a pilot and a sailor, decided to do a transatlantic circuit in a 32-foot sailboat, and he needed crew for different legs of the circuit, and they left Port Clinton and sailed down Lake Erie, Welland Canal or Erie Canal or something, down Lake Ontario, down the St. Lawrence, and across the North Atlantic to England, and then down to Portugal. And his crewman there, his mate, flew home, and then another guy flew out to Portugal and met up, and they went down through the Azores and so on. And that guy came home because Rex wanted to do a crossing solo, and he came across to Barbados in the southern Caribbean there by himself. He said he was about 400-page book short. But he said it was a pretty crazy crossing alone. because you have to wake up every 15 minutes or so to look around to make sure there aren't any big ships around, because they won't even see out there and they just run over you. And he says,
That's comforting.
even though the chances are small, he said, you have to do it if you want to survive. And he made the crossing. Well, anyway, short story long, I met him down in St. Lucia, uh, and another guy, Ron Randolph from Toledo. We met him down there and crewed up through the Lesser Antilles, and had it was a tremendous trip. We got hung up on a fishing buoy in the dark. I was able to. We each took turns in the cockpit on the tiller. It was a tiller steer, and I got to sail the whole night. Steering by the North Star, just like the old time Arabian sailors used to do, up the west coast of Guadeloupe. I'll never forget it, because Rex and Ron were taking a turn getting some shut eye below deck, and I was out there all alone under the stars, and you had all this phosphorescent foam coming off the ship, or the boat. It's little sea creatures that light up when they're disturbed, and it had this green neon glow all around the boat and in the wake as we sailed up. And I just kept steering on the North Star, or a few points off the North Star, to keep my course until dawn. It was just the coolest thing you can ever imagine to have experienced that.
And what year was this approximately?
This would have been around 2007. And what happened was I got off the boat at Antigua and flew home, and then Rex and Ron just hopped a couple more islands to Puerto Rico and put the boat up for a month or so, and then Rex had another crewman meet him down in Puerto Rico again. They got going. They came across the Bermuda Triangle and up into the intracoastal waterway, and they sailed up through coastal Virginia to Chesapeake Bay. And I came back and joined Rex to crew with a guy from Port Clinton named Jim Crawford. He was actually the librarian in Port Clinton at the time, but he was also a sailor. And we met him right at a dock near the U.S. Naval Academy, and we sailed up Chesapeake Bay to the Chesapeake Delaware Canal, and crossed over into right by the mouth of the Delaware River into Delaware Bay, and came down Delaware Bay around Cape May, New Jersey, up the east coast of Jersey, ran into a hellacious storm right at Sandy Hook, which is the main entrance channels into New York Harbor, and got actually keeled over in the storm, even though we had the sails sheeted for storm. And it was quite a religious experience, to say the least. I still remember cooking in the galley after the storm when we were finally at anchor, and it was quite a day. The next day we sailed under the Verrazano Narrows Bridge, and it was the 4th of July, and we motored right up past the Statue of Liberty, which was pretty cool. And then we went up the Hudson River, not under sail but under motor, because it was tough going against the current. So we just motored up the Hudson to the Erie Canal, and we stepped the mast because of the bridges and so on crossing the canal. And I got off there and went home, and Rex stored the boat in a boatyard there for a week or so, he went home. And then he came back with the first guy that crewed, and they came back up. They crossed the Erie Canal and came down Lake Erie to Port Clinton again, and I met him there. But it was a heck of a trip. The stories getting hooked up, got caught. Our keel got caught on an errant rope from a fishing buoy, a commercial fishing buoy off All Saints Island down in the Antilles, and Rex had to crawl and put on dive gear, not scuba, but
Snorkel and anchor.
Yeah, snorkel and mask and knife, and go down and cut us loose while I was holding a floodlight down off the stern in about 7-foot seas, and Ron watched for sharks. And yeah, that was a little tense.
The one thing I think about stories like this is, obviously, if you're not into adventure, like, there's some people that just want to sit home and watch Netflix, right? And that's fine. And then there's guys that are a little more adventuresome. And obviously, you definitely fit into that category. But even with this said, sometimes it's a lot easier and more fun to tell the stories now. Because while that's a great story, I think you'd have to be out of your mind a little bit to not be nervous or when things are going on like that. I mean, is that fair to say? I mean, when we got sharks and we're ropes and we're in just 6-7 foot seas alone is a pain in the ass.
Yeah, it's I don't know what it is. I never would get too nervous because it's one of those things you get nervous afterwards because you just got so much going on that if you don't focus on getting yourself out of the situation, you're going to go down the tubes. And so I guess I sweated a lot after we got loose from that buoy because I mean it was pitch dark. We didn't know why the heck. I was at the tiller actually when we stopped, and the reason I knew it is we were under full sail, and all of a sudden we weren't going anywhere. I looked at I said, Rex, I says, get up here. I said, we're under full sail, but the boat's not moving. and that's when we found out that we were snagged on this line from this fishing buoy, unmarked, just out in the middle of nowhere fishing buoy that was anchored on the bottom. So just unexpected eventualities like that have always been interesting. I've had a few.
Well, I can tell you one. I'm going to give you a little story that you definitely probably don't need any rehashing on. But me and you together with my buddy Big Steve got us in a little bit of a shitstorm. Do you remember that?
Oh, yes, I do. Wasn't that north side of Kelly's?
I believe the name of the story was 2 times what or something like that, because I think the forecast was for like 2 or less, or 2 to 4s or something. And again, I have no idea before I even tell this story how big the waves were, because to mention Old Ugly, I remember, again, just how these things all kind of come together. I was probably 14, 15 years old on the boat with Fofrich Sr., and we were in some shit. And I said to him, I says, Captain Jim, how big are these waves? And again, I'm not old enough to know any better till way afterwards what he was doing, but he said, son, I've never measured a wave a day in my life. And I use that line almost weekly with people. Because, it's a reality. I hear people all the time with just like fish stories, like, oh, we were in 10-footers. I'm like, well, I was out in that lake, and I don't think you and your boat were in 10-footers. But the reality is he was doing it to calm me down, right? Or not to, get bent out of shape, as Old Ugly had that kind of dry, he was a character, right? But
there's no two ways about it. Yeah, I was out in a few of those kind of days when we fished. I was on a single spin fishing team when we competed in the early tournaments out on the lake there, and there were days. I still remember one year. I wasn't on the crew that year, but he was out. He had we called it an organized beer can. He had a big 250 horse outboard on a little cuddy cabin. I can't even remember the name of the boat, but they were out there. They needed one more fish before they got in. A thunderstorm came up. It's where they were still back in the casting days. You'd cast the line, and the line would go up in the air, not to the water. And but what he did he he opened the he flooded the boat to about knee deep to get it down and heavy in the water, and they kept on fishing, and they caught their fish in this thunderstorm, and then he pumped the boat out, and they came back in and got back in time. It was just absolutely insane, but he knew exactly what he was doing, even though there was a risk. He knew what he was doing, and they got back.
Those are stories you can only tell when things are over with, because insurance guys probably have a heart attack. I know.
Oh my God!
I know guys that used to do the same thing for pulling spinners at ultra slow speeds. They'd get that boat in this so the boat wouldn't go anywhere, wouldn't surge off the waves. Unfortunately, you'd be in deep duty if your pumps didn't work too. But
yeah, oh exactly.
But
they'd all still be out there if his pump didn't work.
I can tell you approximately, I believe it was 2006 or 2007 where we kind of started talking about the story that took place north of Kelly's, 2 times water, whatever that title of that story was. I don't know if you remember or not.
Yes.
But
yes.
So we were in the parking lot, if you remember, and I had my right-hand man, Big Steve, who's he's the type of guy, I'll just preface this by saying, he don't get rattled and you don't want to mess with him. Is that fair enough?
Oh, that's totally fair enough.
Yeah, he's security, we call him. People always just wonder how me and him are such good friends, but he's certainly a guy you don't want to not be friends with, I can tell you that.
Exactly.
Anyhow, and if you remember this, we were in the parking lot, and Steve, of course, was busting chops, and not other Steve, not Steve Pollick here, but
right.
And me and you were talking. And you said to me, Bub, he says, I just really appreciate it's getting harder and harder. This is almost just before we retired a few years, I would guess.
Yeah.
And you said, Bub, it's getting real hard to get in and out of the office and get as many of these things in. And I said, I just appreciate you, getting me out here, and that we're going to get a good story out of this. And you're like, what were you going to say again? And I was going to tell you, hey, I just got a bad feeling. And as funny as this, Jim Foffers Jr., as quirky as he was, and I think you'd go with this, he had that quirky sense of just, and this is again before cell phone stuff with Jimmy Jr., where he just knew about like weather stuff. It was like he was like a 90-year-old man and he could feel it in his joints or something. I don't know how many times he would say, hey, wrap them up, we're going in. And everybody would be like, what the hell? It's new and everything's nice. And sure enough, we wouldn't be halfway in and here's the storm coming, And again, before radar. And I had that same kind of feeling. And I was saying, well, I was thinking about maybe just saying, hey, let's go to breakfast. And it just, because again, that was April. The water's 30-some degrees, bad deal. And anyhow, we venture out, and so if people can kind of visualize this, people from around the Ohio area for sure, we were basically between the Bass Islands and west of Kelly's. And when we came around, come around the north side of Kelly's, I don't know how big the waves were. I'm going to say that they were 10-footers, but who knows, doesn't matter. I can tell you, though, that my boat, the motor was gurgling because it was barely in the water, and at the time it was a Ranger 620, and the entire console forward was out of the water, and there was so much gap. It was unbelievable, if you remember this, where you couldn't turn around. Like I could not turn around. I had a boat that will do at the time roughly 60 miles an hour, and I'm doing like 8 to 10 miles an hour at wide open throttle, if you remember that.
I certainly do. And I think that wave was about 100 feet tall.
I'll tell you, you know what? When you're sitting there in a boat, it could have been 100, it could have been 90. It don't matter, but it feels like it was 300. But
all I remember is that when it broke over the stern.
Well, don't get ahead. Don't steal my thunder now. Don't steal my thunder. If you remember this, I mean, this is just, it's funny to me now. Again, this is like when I asked you earlier about how is it easier to tell these things now because you don't get rattled. But those waves were so close together as we get with those current draws and that bottleneck areas there between the islands where it goes from shallow to deep, and the wind just picked up at the perfect time. And there was really nobody out. It was during the week. And any rate, if you can kind of visualize this guy sitting at home, I can't turn the boat around. Like, I can't. And, I've got a Big Steve sitting back there with me who is truthfully one of the best boat drivers that I've ever been around. And I'm on the wheel, and I don't know what to do because I can't go anywhere. It's like someone's like holding the tiger by its tail. And finally, there was a little bit of a dip in between these two waves, and I just gunned it, if you remember, did a 90-degree and rode the trough. And then basically went from like 0 to 100 and then to 0 again. And I had drift bags tied up in the back end, and Steve and me threw those out, which is, drift bags are a really good thing when you get into nasty weather if they help basically position the boat. I'm not talking necessarily about fishing.
Sure.
But at any rate, if we set up, if you remember this, and I remember you just kind of looking at me like, what the hell are we doing? Like, oh, we're going to set some lines up. Well, again, that was kind of the guide coming out in me, you know what I mean? More of like, hey, it's not really about fishing, but I knew I couldn't drive into these things because we would have sunk the bow for sure, right? I mean, just guaranteed deal. So I'm like, okay, we're going to have to basically drift. We're going to put some drift bags out. We're going to throw rods out to make us feel good. And again, I had Big Steve with me. Without him, he's like worth 10 people's hands at that time. And I don't even like saying this out loud because now he has a record of me saying this and giving him a compliment, which is horrific, especially if you ever meet him. But so we set these lines up and we got these 2 drift bags and we are basically going from 0 to 5 miles an hour as we ride up and down on these waves. But if you can picture, we're just trying to basically get where we're parallel with the corner of Kelly's Island so that I can try to trough over. Because these waves are so steep and so close together, there's no way that I can go into a following sea with them. I mean, I don't care how big a boat you would have had. I tell people all the time, that Edmund Fitzgerald's sitting on the bottom for a reason, right?
That's right.
And
I'm getting queasy while you're talking about this.
Yeah, I won't say exactly some of the things that might have transpired. I'm going to let you save face on a few things there. But so the things that I just never will forget about this day, even though I'd probably like to forget the whole thing, I guess that'd be no fun, is we start catching fish, and these waves are so good. If you remember this, I took a rod out of your hand and handed it to Steve, Big Steve, and handed another rod to you, and you're like, what's going on? I'm like, this one's a lot bigger. And you said, you can tell in these conditions? I said, well, normally I probably could, but I said, I saw him come through the wave. Do you remember that?
Yes, I did.
Where the fish literally got pulled through the wave because we weren't catching them that deep, and the fish literally were like, they were getting pulled between waves, and we'd see them shot between. And shortly thereafter is where you had alluded what happened. So I can remember looking back, and I was kneeling down and hooking a fish, and if I remember correctly, we had 3 fish laying on the bottom of the boat. Because we pretty much just straight up were catching. And one of those got used as a picture in your blade column. But nevertheless, I remember looking up and seeing Big Steve's look on his face like someone just grabbed him by the gonads. And again, he's an animal. I've never seen that face, I don't think, since. And as that's happening, he was looking the other way. A wave came, visualize this with me, people. A wave came from the back, went over my motor, went over my head, landed on the front deck of my boat, hit the windshield, sounded like shotgun blasts going off. Now, Mr. Pollick here was sitting between the consoles looking backwards. I literally lost eyesight of him because my entire boat was full of water to the gunnels, right to the cap. And I remember handing the bucket to Big Steve, and I said, you're the co-captain, you do the dirty work, because I always have a bucket in my boat for many things. It's everything, if we call it the brown trout bucket, to the fish count bucket, right? And he's bailing water, and I've got both my pumps going. I got 2 750-gallon pumps per hour, and they're just going. But, my battery compartment, everything's underwater, everything in the boat. My net, do you remember I netted my bait cooler as it floated out the boat?
I remember.
We're knee-deep in water. It's April. It's 30-some degrees out. The air temperature is probably 40-something. I don't remember. But I know that I just look at you, and you look like a drowned rat. And I just remember throwing some things around there we probably can't say out loud even today. But the gist of it was it could have been a really, really, really bad deal. Not that we were in good shape then. Thank God my Mercury started, because if that wouldn't have started, it was everything in the boat was submerged. Electrical, everything.
Yeah, I know.
That's a bad deal, and not much after.
Hearing that motor start was one of the sweetest noises I ever heard.
And that's why it kind of things like that make me think about things. I honestly work with some of the best companies on the planet, and I've turned down quite a bit of money to work with different manufacturers through the years because I really wanted to work with the stuff that I felt was the best. And when you get into circumstances like this, again, not to sound dramatic, but that's a life-changing deal right there. If that motor doesn't start, it's a bad deal. We'd have been in deep doo-doo right then, because we were already in deep doo-doo. But if the motor hadn't started, we really were. When this happens, it's never good. When this happens during the middle of the week, it's bad. It's even worse. When this happens and the water's 30-some degrees, it's really, really bad. This is a bad deal. Thankfully, we had enough of the right gear on and stuff, and it wasn't not that we were dry, but most people are not prepared to physically get in the shower and then get in a bath with your rain gear, right?
That's exactly right.
You don't wear boots that go up to your chin. So at any rate, if you can kind of visualize this, we had drifted just enough and got enough water out of the boat because, again, you can't, even if that motor starts, you've got to get water out because you can't try to put a boat on plane with another 3,000 pounds of water or whatever it is in there, right?
Exactly right.
So we kind of just threw the gear down, and I remember looking, I doubt you remember exactly what I said, but I do because me and Steve, Big Steve, talk about it all the time. I remember looking at him, I said, this is going to be a nasty ride, so unless you break something, including your bones, I said, don't say a word because we're just going to do this. And, I mean, I white-knuckle drove that thing on troughs. I mean, I was down in a trough, and I'm doing 60 miles an hour, 50 miles an hour, whatever it would have been, probably 50, 55, and then I'm back to zero as I crest over the waves, if you remember.
I sure do.
And then once we got towards that gravel dock on the west side of Kelly's, I mean, there were still like 4 or 5 foot waves on the leeward side of the island that was protected in tight there. And I kind of knew then, I think we all kind of knew, like, hey, we really escaped one. I mean, I almost even thought, because people need to realize like how serious this was, I even thought about going into, as I was driving, I don't think I even shared this with you, even though we were roughly 4 miles from home at that point, because of us being wet and not knowing what the conditions would be on that South Passage, I thought seriously about tying up at Kelly's Island and getting help there somewhere, because this could have been like hypothermia. I mean, this is a bad deal.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I don't know if you remember the last half of this, but we were the only rig in the parking lot. Shocker. And I remember hearing a noise the whole time because I was just focused, dialed in the zone, whatever you want to call it, white-knuckled for sure. And when I pulled into that dock in Marblehead, I can just remember seeing a guy that I know at the dock said, "You dumb son of a bitch," because the Coast Guard had been, put out, and some guys passed away that day, if you remember. And we
I do.
We had a Coast Guard helicopter that actually had followed us halfway in, and that was the noise that we were hearing. And I never even asked you, I guess, if you even knew that was a helicopter at the time out of Marblehead right there, because I couldn't look anywhere than on, right in front of me, basically.
I think I was concentrating on one of your number one rules: don't leave the boat.
Yeah, I only have a couple, and that's the one: stay in the boat and don't get drunk. And we don't let guys drink in the boat. So usually number one is trumps just about everything. But
yeah, I was not worried about Coast Guard helicopters or anything else besides keeping my rear end in the boat.
And again, that's one of those things as people tell these stories. I say that now 15 roughly years later. That's not like something that you really boast about. That was one of those storms. It was a pocketed thing. I can remember talking to the Coast Guard guys later, and they said that they knew it was going to be a bad deal because it came out of nowhere. And that's the thing people don't realize about the Great Lakes is we get these little pocket storms that aren't something that are really predictable, and they just kind of show up like the Bermuda Triangle stuff. And they put you in a bad way. And when you're out there in that cold of water, it's a bad, bad, bad deal.
Yeah. Oh, we'd have never left. We'd have never left the dock if we'd have known it was going to be like that.
No, and it wasn't. I mean, it literally in the 10 to 15 minutes from us leaving Marblehead to getting to Kelly's, because that's roughly a 5, maybe 6 mile boat ride there. It went from 0 to 100. I mean, if we would have literally left 10 minutes later, we wouldn't have left.
Exactly.
And again, the thing that I think nowadays people, and you hear stuff and everybody sensationalizes everything, like we were talking about, joking about the journalism and fake news and stuff. That's a cool story to tell, but that's not a cool story to put yourself in position on purpose. Like this is totally an accidental thing. And again, of the millions of days that seemingly that I fished out there, roughly 4,000 actually, you don't put yourself in those circumstances anywhere on purpose, and if you do, you are really a dumb SOB.
Yeah, that is not that was not an assignment you volunteer for ahead of time.
But it makes a hell of a story, Steve.
It sure does. I've had a few like that, but boy, that one's memorable. It made a hell of a column too.
Yeah, me and Big Steve, I don't know if it's just the character driven or the number of days together, but we had one a story for another day, but we had something similar on near the St. Lawrence Seaway on Lake Ontario where me and him got into, and it was not a fun day. But those boat rides like that, I'm pretty sure that I'd be 6'5" if I hadn't taken but a few of those out of the mix.
They do tend to compress the spine a bit.
And another one that, again, I think people will love, and I don't even remember the whole length of it, but when you went, didn't you go to Kenya from a small plane traveling here somewhere in Ohio?
Oh yeah, that was the same Rex Damshoulder, but this would have been.
So Rex is your big Steve. Is basically what we're hearing.
Yeah, basically it. Rex was grew up in a flying family, and he got a pilot's license early on, and found a good way to make money was to ferry single engine bush planes to Africa to deliver them to missionaries. And because it's easier to put extra gas tanks in a little plane if you're half nuts, and fly it across the North Atlantic and the Sahara Desert and deliver them to the missionaries than it is to dismantle a plane and put it on a boat and reassemble it, because there aren't many good aircraft mechanics in Africa. So he got into the business in college, and at the time was the youngest pilot to ferry a plane across the Atlantic. He made headlines in Europe because he bounced into a potato field out of gas in Ireland on the first time over, but it didn't stop him. He kept ferrying planes. I don't remember what number I was, but I was the last one he did, and we flew a Cessna 210 Centurion turbocharged. It was the high wing plane, but it had retractable landing gear, and it was a really nice plane. I actually learned to fly for this trip with Rex, and we left Fostoria, Ohio, and flew to the Goose Bay, Labrador. From Goose Bay, Labrador, we flew across the south tip of Greenland to Reykjavik, Iceland, and from Reykjavik we flew down over Stornoway, Scotland, and England, Wales, and then England itself, and landed on Jersey, one of the Channel Islands off the coast of France. And then we flew to Naples, Italy, and then down across the Mediterranean, east across the Mediterranean, and down the Nile River to Luxor, Egypt, and then made our last leg, 2,023 miles and 14 hours airborne to Nairobi, Kenya, down the Great Rift Valley. And the adventures on that one are a long story that go beyond the scope of the podcast right now. But
was there any jail time involved or anything like that with any of these trips?
Well, we were threatened with jail time coming out of the country, because when we landed at it's called Wilson Field. That's where all the bush planes from the cattle ranchers and whatnot come into. We didn't go into Jomo Kenyatta International Airport where the big airliners go in. And the first thing we wanted to do when we got there was pee, because we'd been aloft 14 hours. And there are no restrooms in a Cessna 210. And so anyways, we got there and handed our passports, and we had crew uniforms on, hats and shirts with the epaulets and the hash marks and all this stuff. And that was another story why we were dressed that way. But anyway, we handed our passports, went to the bathroom. These guys looked at our passports and handed them back. Well, flight crews are not required to have visas for 72 hours. You get 72 hours in country, and then you're off and gone again, so they don't do a visa. Well, we came in posing as a flight crew, and so they didn't stamp our visas as entering Kenya. And so Rex and I proceeded to go down to the New Stanley Hotel in Nairobi. That's where all the white hunters like Hemingway and
I don't know how you remember all this. I can't even remember what I had for breakfast, and I got less years under me than you.
Yeah. Well, we went there and celebrated with Sundowners, which is the white hunter drink. But anyways, then we went on a hot air balloon safari down in the Masai Mara country. And anyways, we're going to leave the country through Jomo Kenyatta. It was the first thing we do. We run up, turn in our passports, and says, "Where's your entry visas? You guys are in this country illegally."
I mean, you do look like a drug runner. I mean, just for fair shades.
Yeah, I'm telling you what, we were sweating bullets. We talked our way past this guy, and we had been warned, one thing you never do is try to bribe a local official, because they'll throw you in jail without trial for 6 months. And they said, you don't want to be in a Kenyan jail, white man, at all.
For 6 months? Yeah, I could assume probably 6 hours, but I hear you.
Yeah, well, they said you won't even be able to call an attorney if you get in there, because you're going to get lost. Anyways, so we're sweating bullets, and we get past him, and we get right up to where the gate's going to be, and the British Airways flight from South Africa, which is headed to London, which is going to be our plane, wasn't due in for a couple hours, and we got all these soldiers running around with submachine guns, looking at people and scrutinizing stuff. He and I ducked into the men's room, went into 2 stalls, locked the doors, and sat up on the toilet so you couldn't see that there were people in there. And we just hunkered in there for 2 hours while we were waiting for the British Airways to come in, because if we had been checked again, we'd have been arrested. Because we were already past passport control, and we were, basically illegally in the country. So, anyways, that was the short story, but that's how we almost got thrown in jail. The greatest sound I ever heard on that trip, besides the door being closed on the 747 to London, was when the landing gear went up. We ordered a round of drinks as soon as we reached cruise altitude on the way to London.
I can imagine. That's that's kind of like some of these Alaskan things. I mean, this is serious business. I mean, there's a big difference between adventure and sitting in a Kenya jail or any of those small countries over there where they just don't really care.
Well, like Rick said, the further south you go from the equator, the less the law applies.
But that's crazy. I mean, again, is it even possible to recreate? Like my dad used to always say this. My dad went on a lot of hunting trips. He used to go in the bush for a month on end in Alaska and northern Canada. And, he even said, no, this is going back 20 years ago. He'd say, hey, you can't recreate these things because a lot of the characters that were involved in this aren't doing it anymore. They're either dead, or a bunch of the bush pilots that he knew, had flown into mountains and doing too much crazy stuff or just passed away. And I don't know if you could afford to do it, or if are there even some of the players left to even do this stuff anymore in all reality?
Oh, the scope and the focus on stuff has all changed in time, and that was of a time. Roger Dowding, bush pilot that picked us up off a gravel bar on the North Slope, once we drafted down the Congacut River when I was up in Alaska. About a year later, he flew into a mountain and died. And it just that's the things that happen.
And it's exactly. I mean, we've lost my dad a couple of years ago. Jerry Austin, the guy I mentioned in Alaska, he's no longer around. A bunch of these bush pilots, I can remember Coyne Callison was one of them that they used to do some of this stuff with. And bringing back a story that involves me and you, you hooked me up with Marion Garber, literally world famous fly caster, to give me some private lessons for a competition that I was going into, where I thought I was going to have some fly casting accuracy. And anybody that knows me well knows I'm not a big fan of the buggy whip. And I can just remember you telling me, now I'm going to hook you up with this guy, but he doesn't really do lessons like this anymore. So just answer your phone, play it cool. Do you remember this?
Yes, I do.
I mean, God, he had to be 80 something at the time. And we went to a park in Toledo, and it definitely was a place you would not have wanted to be after dark. I can promise you that. And we're whipping fly rods around. And here's this guy. He only had sight in one eye at the time. I mean, is that pretty
Yeah,
accurate?
yeah. He'd had a cataract surgery gone bad.
And
So one-eyed. Yeah.
we went for 3 hours, and he screamed at me for 3 hours. And when I mean screamed at me, I mean, dude, like a drill sergeant would have been proud. And and I mean, it was like, I mean, the guy even at that with one eye. I mean, think about your depth perception and stuff that you're losing. I mean, you know the stories when you used to work with him in some of the Toledo shows and things where he used to knock the ash off a cigarette. I mean, tell him about that. I mean, you want to talk about skills.
Yeah, he was just incredible. I saw him. The Blade used to run some outdoor shows down at Seagate Center. Like in February, and everybody's got cabin fever. And one of the talents that I brought in was Marion to do his fly casting demonstrations, and one of them had a model would hold a lit cigarette in her lips, and he would take the ash off the cigarette without taking the cigarette out of her mouth. It was just it was just an incredible. Some of his casting records for accuracy have never been broken.
All I can tell you is that roughly 80 some years and with one eye, he was still maybe not quite that, but it was insane to sit there and watch. And here I am, and I'm not kidding you, Steve, for 3 hours. I don't know if you remember this or if he called you afterwards. He ripped my ass for 3 hours. And like, I'm kind of good at what I do. You know what I mean? Now, I'm certainly no fly fisherman or fly accuracy guy. That's hence the lessons. And you actually took me out as well in a pond near your house and gave me some lessons. But you get a little practice there. But I'll never forget at the end of 3 hours, I just looked at him like someone had just like beat puppies and drank baby seal tears and killed angels in front of me. And I looked at him and I was like, have you ever seen? He's like, you are one hell of a student. And I was like, you don't need to be an asshole about it. I said, I'm gonna go practice again, and can we do this again? He's like, oh no, you were a phenomenal student. And I just remember looking at him and I said, what do you say to the people that are not good students? And he just looked at me and he said, there's a reason you're here, and it ain't because of you. My buddy Steve said to help you out, or you wouldn't be here. And I'll never forget that. I thought, holy shit, if he didn't think that you had talent, I can't imagine what he would have done.
He was quite a boy.
No doubt. And while we could tell stories for a million years, and we definitely have to have you back and talk about some, give me one more that just kind of makes you, again, I know that I think about things throughout the years, like our trip north of Kelly's Island there with the 2 times what is one that I tell people in the boat and here and there at different fishing events and such. Give me one more of those travels that, you still kind of think about yourself like, hey, that was kind of the deal.
Well, we talked about fishing. I was invited to go to the Czech Republic in Southeast Europe with a friend of mine, Lucas Novotny, who was a world-renowned bow builder he does horn bows made out of wild oxen horn, just like Genghis Khan's people did. That's the backstory on him. But he was from the Czech Republic, and we went red stag and wild boar hunting there. Make a short story long, or a long story short. We both got red stags I took a couple of single shot rifles with us that the Jagermeister really admired and da. We both bagged stags that he directed us to do. European style hunting is very prescriptive, and the Jagermeister of the forest decides which animals he wants to cull. And so we culled a couple of smaller bulls that he didn't want in the mix. And long story short, you take the head of the animal, and his helpers do the butchering, and they sell the meat. That's part of their business. But you carry and they dip the fur branches in blood, and smeared it on our face and did the ceremony out in the woods. And then you carry the antler and head and your rifle back to the hostel where we were staying, and the lower floor was a big restaurant. And he marched us right into this busy restaurant, great big stone fireplace, rifles on our shoulders, dripping antler, heads, and propped them up against the fireplace, and they put a votive candle on
Do you
the
think
top.
that this would fly today?
No, I don't think so. And when we walked in with that Jagermeister, everybody in the restaurant stood up and applauded.
And just for the record, we're not talking about Jagermeister like as in the shot that'll keel you over.
No, we're talking about the real honest to God Jagermeister. That's the hunt and forest master of a forest, and what he's God in the forest. What trees get cut, what animals get culled, or what trophies get shot, so on and so on. And so, a couple nights later, we're back in this restaurant. Had been hunting all night long from old Cold War guard towers along the border with East Germany, and no results. But anyway, we're back at dinner, and here the Jagermeister comes in with this other Jagermeister, and the guy is the president of the Jagermeisters Guild of the Czech Republic, and he inducted Lucas and I into the Jagermeisters Guild of the Czech Republic. And what they do is he has this old ceremonial sword from going back like to the 16th or 17th century, and he does his ceremonial talk, and they tap you on each shoulder while you're down on one knee, and then you stand up and bend over, and he takes the flat of the sword and smacks you across the rear end as hard as he can to remind you and the ceremony is to remind you of the pain the animal took when they took the bullet. And after that, of course, you get more applause. But then, so I'm an honorary Jagermeister of the Czech Republic, and so was Lucas. But that was the ceremony, and it was wait. I mean, who knew? I never knew that was coming.
I mean, I feel like I should. It's like Sir Paul McCartney. I mean, there might be more titles here that I gotta call you moving forward.
No, I don't think so. just don't call me Lake for breakfast. That's all.
Well, yeah, there is a few names, but we'll keep those as our own personal things.
I would thank you very much for that.
Our boat names. Everybody that's ever fished with me knows you get a boat name. Everybody gets a boat name, and you got to fish with us or be part of the clique to know what everybody else's is. It's kind of like your undercover code word, but.
I got it.
Well, I just want to thank you for not only taking time, but definitely in the early years helping you get some street cred by putting me in that column so much and all the time we fished together. And even later on, a lot of people probably don't know you definitely were instrumental in me getting my TV show and doing stuff in those early years. And I can't thank you enough for all of that help.
Oh, you're most welcome. I've enjoyed the whole ride.
Probably one of the best compliments I got is from you, and I've told this story, or it's not really a story, it's kind of a one-liner, if you will, and I use it all the time, and I'm not even sure that you came up with it, but I definitely credit it to you, even if not, is you said, "Son, you are no broken clock fisherman," and I tell people that all the time as a mass of credibility, because I remember just when you first told me that, you're like, a lot of people are right twice a day. That's a broken clock fisherman.
That's right.
So
they think they're going to catch a walleye with the same lure in the same place that they did the one time they caught a 28-inch fish.
Yeah, it's crazy how that goes. But, well, you probably won't be able to do as many adventures as you have. You've done enough for about 10 people's lifetimes, and I hope we can have you back on again to talk about some more, because we definitely have just touched the tip of the iceberg, if you will, of
it would be a pleasure. I've been very pleased to be on board with you.
Thanks again, and I hope you have you guys all back. Steve, again, can't thank you enough.
Thank you, and good fishing.
Likewise. We're out.